Welcome back to Raw Politics. Mourners gathered in Pittsburgh and throughout the world at the weekend to pay tribute to the victims of the worst anti-Semitic attack in U.S. history. On Saturday, a heavily armed man shot dead 11 worshippers and injured 6 others during a service in the True of Life synagogue. The gunman later told police he, quote, just wanted to kill Jews, end quote. World leaders, including the Pope, condemned the attack, while local Jewish leaders warned that anti-Semitism is not a thing of the past or a chapter in the history books. It is a very real threat. Now, that attack in Pittsburgh has highlighted the rise of anti-Semitic incidents here in Europe as well. The European Commission's coordinator for combating anti-Semitism, Katharina von Schnorbein, has warned that, quote, anti-Semitism is on the rise all across Europe. It is a sign that something is going wrong with society, end quote. In the UK, 2018 has seen the second highest number of anti-Semitic incidents ever recorded in the January to June period. In France, 16,000 Jews have emigrated in the last 3 years. Mass protests were sparked in Paris after 2 elderly Jewish women were murdered in their homes within a year of one another. 2/3 of Germany's Jews, when answering a 2017 survey, said they don't feel themselves to be part of German society. Authoritarian leaders in Eastern Europe are also widely viewed as fueling anti-Semitic rhetoric. Hungary's Viktor Orban has spearheaded a campaign to demonize Hungarian Jewish philanthropist George Soros. And joining me in the studio to take stock of anti-Semitism in Europe, we have our political editor still with us, Darren McCaffrey, Esther Zalan from the EU Observer, and joining us for this panel is Michael Sieveking, who's Deputy Director of the American Jewish Community. I'll start with you, Michael. What is the feeling among the Jewish communities in Europe about anti-Semitism?
Well, the feeling is one of outrage at the events that occurred just in Pittsburgh, and we as an American organization are here to be in touch with our friends in the Jewish communities. Sorry.
No, go ahead. But do you feel that there is a rise indeed?
Yes, absolutely. There has been in recent years a rise in anti-Semitism throughout Europe. Since 2012, there have been 14 Jews murdered because they were Jews. And we've seen an increase of attacks targeting Jewish facilities, and that's...
And what is the sense? Why? What is the sense from the Jewish perspective that this is happening? Why is this happening?
Well, there are various reasons and various origins of anti-Semitism, and we have seen in the United States that it came from a far-right nationalist, white supremacist, while here in Europe, on the ground, we observed that all fatal murderous attacks on Jewish facilities were all motivated by jihadist radical Islamists. So we have to analyze very closely the origins and the different nature of the attacks. You might say that the Brussels attack in 2014 was the 9/11 of the Brussels, or rather the Jewish community here in Belgium, and we're still feeling the reverberations till today.
Right, and we, if you look to Hungary, we're hearing anti-Semitic rhetoric coming from Viktor Orban himself.
Yeah,
what is behind that?
That's a fascinating phenomenon, I think, because he says he has zero tolerance for anti-Semitism, yet one of the major campaigns that the government is financing is claiming without any evidence that George Soros, a US billionaire who's of Hungarian Jewish origins, is bringing millions of migrants into Europe and therefore threatening European and Christian identity. So there are very not so subtle anti-Semitic overtones in that. But I think what's fascinating is that the Israeli government is supporting Prime Minister, Prime Minister Orban.
And what's interesting to point out to what Michael was saying is that the different nature, like before it was probably rooted in a feeling of the supreme race, but now we're talking about politics, maybe the Arab-Israeli conflict spilling into domestic issues.
Yeah,
like
and I think also we're in an era of identity politics, and it's, anti-Semitism is on the rise, but racism in general is on the rise throughout Europe, and that's reflective of the fact that, people and leaders are pointing out differences, and we're in this identity politics era. And so clearly, for some vexed issues like the Israeli-Palestinian issue, it is the chance to stoke up that sense of identity and that sense of difference. And that is something that Europe is struggling with, and it is something that Europe's leaders are struggling with because they're not properly dealing with it.
Indeed.
Either they're potentially stoking it up or they're not combating it as a serious issue.
Indeed, it is a problem that the EU is recognizing. We have the EU coordinator on combating anti-Semitism, Katharina von Schnurbein. She's joining us now from Heidelberg in Germany. Katharina, it's very good to have you with us. All right, how big of a problem is this in Europe and what's driving it?
We have seen a tremendous increase, not only of incidents, but also of the fear that is among the Jewish community with regards to the threats they perceived. And I think that is the important issue. Do Jews still see a future for themselves here in Europe? And when we see the numbers of Jews that have left Europe, and also the incidents that, when they are recorded correctly, have gone up, I think that is of great concern to all of us, because we have always seen in the past in Europe, when anti-Semitism is on the rise, it's not only bad for the Jewish community, it's bad for Europe as a whole. And therefore, at the European Commission, we have taken different measures to counter anti-Semitism in different forms. We have endorsed a definition that has been adopted also by the European Parliament that points at the different forms of anti-Semitism that Mr. Sieveking has been referring to, and that therefore gives a good basis for public debate, because indeed it all starts with the recognition that it is a problem, and that on all levels, so from the European level, the national level, the local level, the schoolmasters, law enforcement authorities, we have to tackle this problem and this poison in our own environment.
All right, just very quickly, yes or no. Do you think this trend is set to continue?
Unfortunately, at the moment it is, because Jews are being perceived still, after centuries of having been here, as the other. And when there is a general increase, as was said already, against the other in forms of racism in general, unfortunately it reflects also on the Jews.
All right, thank you very much for that. Katharina von Schnurbein joining us from Heidelberg there, Germany, EU coordinator on combating anti-Semitism. All right, bring it back to the panel. Michael, do you feel that the Jewish community feel that Europe is no longer a safe place to be living in this day and age?
I would say that if we look at the events and the facts following the radical attacks on the Jewish facilities here in Europe, we have seen, just as Katharina just said, that the numbers of Jews leaving Europe to Israel, to the nation-state of the Jewish people, or to the United States demonstrate clearly that, for example, in France in the year 2015, in the first half year, there were 7,000. It was a stark increase. So, in a sense, it is a thing through which to look at the rise of anti-Semitism.
I want to bring Darren, because we were talking before the show, talking about the UK, because we have a lot of talk of anti-Semitism with regard to Jeremy Corbyn's party.
And there's almost, I think, 100 attacks nearly a month.
And the way they say, you know, there's a difference between anti-Semitism, racism, and criticizing a foreign policy. I mean, you have your views on that.
The problem is that, yes, of course, you know, it is the responsibility, I would almost say, of British politicians, and indeed of any politician, to have a view on the actions of different states across the world. And clearly the Labour leadership, as it currently is very critical of the state of Israel, and that is perfectly within their right. The problem is that they have allowed those lines then to be blurred. Where that then steps into the realm of being Jewish, critical of Judaism, and allowing, which many would accuse Jeremy Corbyn of doing, allowing anti-Semitism as part of that overall wider political narrative to grow up. And that he has not done enough to slap that down and to make it clear, you know, that there is a big distinction between the criticism of Israel as a state and indeed its actions, and not allowing that to stray into, you know, the dark, very poisonous world of anti-Semitism.
I think that's an important point,
quickly,
but also, I mean, anti-Semitism has been around before. I think what really has changed is that political leaders are suggesting or saying out loud that this is okay, and it's no longer a taboo.
I think the important thing is recognizing what the issues are, then moving forward. All right, a very sensitive issue indeed.